If you like our podcast, we think you'll love our Next Economy MBA. It's a 9-month learning journey for entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, and aspiring change makers alike. Our MBA gives emerging leaders a new set of blueprints for creating life-serving, regenerative organizations. We explore topics like regenerative finance, cooperative models of ownership, alternative economics, and much more. You'll leave inspired by the stories of leading Next Economy organizations, and you'll be nourished by a community of mission-aligned peers. So we invite you to join our flourishing community of more than 275 alumni and growing. Visit lifteconomy.com/MBA to learn more. That's lifteconomy.com/MBA to learn more. Cohort 8, our newest cohort, starts on March 29th, 2022. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Saru Jayaraman. Saru is an academic at UC Berkeley and the president of One Fair Wage, a national organization working to raise wages for service workers nationwide. She was named one of CNN's top 10 visionary women, a White House champion of change, a James Beard Foundation Leadership Award winner, and the San Francisco Chronicle's Visionary of the Year. Saru authored Behind the Kitchen Door, which was published by Cornell University Press, and Forked, a new standard for American dining from Oxford University Press. Saru's appeared on MSNBC, HBO, PBS, CBS, and CNN. Saru, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Saru, I'm curious, how did you first get interested in the work you're doing today?
Well, in terms of general kind of social justice work, I really can't remember a time that I wasn't. I mean, I was an angry kid and felt a lot of injustice around me. So I've always felt the calling to do something about it. But in terms of restaurant workers, that really started on 9/11 when there was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Tower 1. And on that morning, 73 workers died. And about 13,000 restaurant workers lost their jobs. And I was asked to start a relief center in the aftermath of the tragedy that began as just like a support center for restaurant workers, grew into a national organization fighting to raise wages and working conditions in the restaurant industry. And out of that developed this campaign called One Fair Wage to end all sub-minimum wages in the US. And over that period, it just has gotten clearer and clearer and clearer why we do this work, why we fight. This is not just about 13 million workers in the restaurant industry. This goes to the core of our democracy and our economy and our identity as a country.
Yeah, and can you tell listeners about the connections between the, quote, other NRA, slavery, and tipping, and sort of the sordid history and connection between those?
Absolutely. So the restaurant industry prior to the pandemic was the second largest and absolute fastest growing private sector employer in the United States, almost 14 million workers, actually. But it has been the absolute lowest paying employer, largest and lowest paying at the same time for generations, really since emancipation of slavery, when the restaurant industry first sought the right, the ability to hire newly freed Black people and not pay them anything at all, and basically continue slavery by having them live entirely on tips with no wage from their employer. And that was a mutation of tipping. Tipping had originated in feudal Europe as an extra or bonus on top of a wage for a serf or a vassal working on a nobleman's land, and I say nobleman because they're mostly men. But when it came to the States, that idea of tipping, it came right around the time of emancipation, and American restaurant owners mutated tipping into being the only source of income for newly freed Black people. And so that became law in 1938 as part of the New Deal, and everybody got the right to the federal minimum wage for the first time, except millions of Black workers were excluded. Domestic workers were excluded. Farm workers who were mostly Black at the time were excluded, and tipped restaurant workers who were mostly Black women at the time were excluded. And we went from a $0 wage in 1938 all the way up to the current federal minimum wage for tipped workers, which is $2.13 an hour. And the reason that it has not gone up more than $2 in, you might say, 80 years since we first got the federal minimum wage, or you might say 150 years since emancipation, it's not gone up in 150 years, more than $2, really comes down to the money, power, and influence of the trade lobby, which is the National Restaurant Association, formed a few decades after emancipation and has been around with the sole focus, so powerful and so focused on really keeping wages as low as humanly possible in this sector. And it's really driven by the chains, the IHOPs, the Denny's, the Applebee's, very resistant to any kind of change and very duplicitously so. I mean, just this year, when Biden was really pushing for $15 and one fair wage, ending the sub minimum wage for tipped workers to be part of the first COVID relief package, Denny's and all of these chains were telling Congress that's impossible, we'll die, the industry will collapse if we are made to pay 15 and if we're made to pay tipped workers more than $2 an hour. Well, in that same moment earlier this year, unbeknownst to anybody, the CFO of Denny's was telling shareholders on a shareholder call that paying $15 and what we call one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top in the state of California, had caused Denny's to, in his words, outperform the system, grow faster in California than any other state in the US because they paid people more and consumer spending was up. So they know it. They've admitted it. It is just pure lies and greed that they have pushed on both parties. Both parties listen to them, really saying it's impossible for us to raise wages. It's impossible for us to pay our own workers. You, the customers, need to pay our workers' wages through tips. We should not be made to pay our own workers' wages. It's impossible. We'll go out of business. Even though the 7 states that require restaurants to pay their workers a full minimum wage with tips on top, including California, but also Alaska and Montana and Nevada and Oregon and Washington, Minnesota, they all have higher restaurant industry sales than the rest of the country, greater small business growth rates in the rest of the country, higher job growth rates in the restaurant industry, tipping is higher, and maybe most importantly for this workforce that is overwhelmingly women. And that's another answer to the question of why has it not gone up more than $2? Partly it's the power of the National Restaurant Association. And then on the other hand, it's the fact that this is overwhelmingly women. This is an industry that is overwhelmingly women, that's been undervalued like so many other industries that are mostly women. And this population of mostly women has suffered from the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry in the United States because they must tolerate inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families and tips. Well, in the 7 states that require full minimum wage with tips on top, we see that actually sexual harassment is 1/2 the rate that it is in states that pay their workers $2 an hour. And that's because in California and Alaska and Oregon, Washington, a woman gets a full minimum wage from her boss. She's not as dependent on the customer for tips. And so she's willing to put up with anything and everything from customers, or not, or I should say in the other states, she's willing to put up with it. In California and Alaska, she's not as willing to put up with it because she can count on a wage from her boss, like every other worker in every other industry.
How has the pandemic, both in sort of the 2020 initial wave and then this current year, affected restaurant workers?
Well, it's actually a really positive silver lining of the pandemic. I mean, I'm going to tell you a lot of doom and gloom, but there is really, truly so much hope on the way. This pandemic has completely upended our industry. So in March of 2020, 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. Restaurants shut down, of course, across the country. And two-thirds of those 6 million workers who lost their jobs told us that they couldn't get unemployment insurance in most states because they were told that sub-minimum wage of $2 or $3 or $4 or $5, whatever it is in their state, was too low to qualify for benefits. So they were penalized for this industry's stubborn refusal to pay its workers more. so many workers were forced to go back to work before they felt safe to do so. Last summer, we heard from thousands of workers that tips went way down because sales were down, and health risks and customer harassment and hostility were way up, with thousands of women telling us, I'm repeatedly asked, take off your mask so I can see how cute you are before I decide how much to tip you. And pretty much everybody feeling like they had to enforce social distancing and mask rules and now vaccination card rules on the same customers from whom they had to get tips, which was an impossible situation. And workers reached their breaking point. This combination of a sub-minimum wage with the highest risk environment you can imagine, and then being treated the way they were treated by customers, it just was like somebody might say a cluster. It was just people reached their breaking point, and 1 million workers have left this industry since the pandemic started. And that's 1 in 10 American workers in this restaurant industry has left. And of those who remain, we surveyed those who remain this year and have found that 54% of workers who remain in the industry say they're leaving. And 78% say the only thing that would make them stay or come back to work in restaurants is one fair wage, a full livable wage with tips on top. So workers have been very clear. They're not staying home because they've been collecting unemployment insurance. They never got it. They're not staying home for any other reason. They are very clear. The top reason they don't want to work in restaurants is because the pay doesn't work anymore. They can't afford to work in restaurants anymore. And so that has resulted in what I was mentioning is the silver lining. Workers finally standing up for themselves for the first time in 150 years since emancipation and saying, I just won't work for these wages anymore, has resulted in us being able to document thousands of restaurants across the country now paying $15, $20, $25 an hour plus tips in order to get workers to come back. So we are seeing wages go up. But a lot of those employers who are raising wages are saying, I can't do it alone. I need a level playing field so that the chains have to pay it just like me. But I also need policy. I need states and the federal government to pass one fair wage as policy, ending the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, requiring everybody to pay a full minimum wage across the board, because that's the only way we're going to be able to send a signal to the 1 million workers who've left. Come back. It's worth working in restaurants again, because this is not going to be a temporary hiring bonus, which a lot of workers are worried about. This is going to be permanent change codified into law. Come back. It's worth working in restaurants, which frankly, a lot of these workers want to do. People take great pride in hospitality. People love working in restaurants. It's a real career and a profession for many, many people, but they just can't afford to do it anymore. And I know a lot of people would come back to their really beloved profession if they were paid as the professionals that they are.
Yeah, I heard a report from the New York Times that employers like Amazon are having to make concessions to workers in terms of higher wages and better benefits in order to get people to actually work for them. So are you seeing subtle shifts in power towards labor in the last year?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Workers are standing up saying we don't want to work for these wages. They're also, forming unions. They're also walking out on the job. This holiday season, we've seen hundreds of workers saying we're refusing to work on Christmas Eve, like we always are asked to, for sub-minimum wages. Other workers get double time, 1.5 times. I've heard some people get triple pay for working on Christmas Eve and other holidays. Tipped workers, restaurant workers still get a sub-minimum wage when they're working on Christmas Eve and Thanksgiving. So a lot of workers have reached their breaking point. And I think what is the National Restaurant Association, the other NRA, is going to have to come to terms with is, as stubbornly as you refuse, as dug in as you are, you're just not going to get workers to come back unless you pay them a full wage. They're just not going to be willing to do it.
Yeah, and I think the narrative in the media, at least, I've recently heard a lot about costs are rising for small businesses, and like that's framed as being bad, when part of those rising costs might be wages actually being paid at a level that's reasonable compared to wages being flat for the last 40 or 50 years.
Right. And that's the thing is, listen, if inflation is happening, our economy is going to tank if we don't have a consumer base to handle that inflation. And so workers need to be paid enough to be able to consume as costs go up across the board.
I'm actually working with a restaurant in San Francisco that's trying to do this the right way. They're paying every staff a salary, like no hourly, everyone's paid salary living wage, full benefits. I'm curious, like, what would you recommend to anyone who's maybe listening or wants to do it right in the restaurant industry? Maybe they're a restaurant owner or know someone. Like, what would be like the tips on like doing this well?
Yeah. So we actually have an association of over 2,000, what we call high road restaurants that are paying workers well, treating them well. And beyond that association of 2,000, I mentioned that we've been tracking over 3,000 additional restaurants that have raised their wages to one fair wage. And our association provides free training and support to restaurants that want to transition. We have all kinds of spreadsheets that you can input and a calculator, you can input your menu prices and the size of your restaurant. It'll kind of show you how to increase wages profitably, we also do training on how to increase race and gender equity in your restaurants. So people can go to highroadrestaurants.org and see the list of restaurants that are part of our association called Raise. You can also find out more in terms of getting involved and getting that free training to learn how to do this profitably.
And in terms of your relationship to this, what are the values that you're bringing to this work and how have those shifted over time?
Ultimately, I mentioned at the start of this that to me, the reason I've stayed working on this for 20 years is that I think this is fundamentally not just about the amount of money a person gets, but it is fundamentally about democracy. The idea that people in this country, supposedly we're a democracy, so people, voters in this country, should have as much power and say as corporations do, as the National Restaurant Association does. It's that fundamental value of democracy and economic democracy and fairness that, to me, drives this idea that people in this country overwhelmingly support living wages. Even Republican voters overwhelmingly support living wages. The only reason wages haven't gone up is not because it's not the most popular issue out there. It's because the elected officials are in the pocket and in an echo chamber with the restaurant association and restaurants that belong to the restaurant association in their districts. And so they think, oh, this is a controversial issue, when if you were to ask the vast majority of their voters in red and blue states alike, the vast majority of their voters would say it is so not controversial. Everybody deserves a living wage. So to me, this is fundamentally about democracy. Who gets to dictate what we do in this country? It's supposed to be the overwhelming majority of people, of voters, but that's not what's happening. It's these corporate trade lobbies that are dictating, no, let's keep the wage at $2. No, let's keep the minimum wage at $7. Those are unnaturally suppressed wages from an unnaturally imbalanced system where you've got some corporate trade lobbies overriding our democracy. So the value has to be democracy, fairness, and justice, both race and gender and economic justice, that ultimately that's the only way we are going to actually come out of this pandemic. I mean, the level of injustice has gone so far, it's just reached such a breaking point that just you're seeing these staffing crises across so many sectors, including the restaurant industry. So they've gone too far for too long, and people have had it. And unless the elected officials in both parties figure it out, we're going to keep heading towards disaster.
I see you grinding against these big corporate lobbies and, fighting this fight. And I'm curious on a personal level, how do you stay sane? Like, what are your self-care? Like, how do you just keep in the fight? What do you do to take care of yourself so that you can be energized for all these fights that you're constantly going up against?
This is always the $1 million question. I have two children, two girls, 9 and 11. And to me, they are what drives me and motivates me. I would be very proud if they worked in the industry, in the restaurant industry at some point in their life. I mean, 1 in 2 Americans works in the restaurant industry at some point in their life. Quite often people work in the restaurant industry in college, graduate school. I'm so driven to make sure that by the time they do that, We've raised wages and ended sexual harassment in our industry that's so pervasive and severe because these women have to tolerate so much to get tips. Like, I am so driven to make sure things change so that the next generation doesn't have to deal with this. That's what keeps me going. It's definitely exhausting and traumatic to be, you use the word grinding. I will be more direct. I mean, they've attacked us for 20 years. They've tried to shut us down. They've put my kids' pictures up on attack websites. They followed me around the country. They've tried to get funders to stop. They've bullied some of our funders, going to their homes, trying to get them to stop funding us. I mean, they have the money. They've taken out full page ads in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, attacking us. So they're bullies. They're bullies. And frankly, they're dinosaurs. The industry is moving in a certain direction. Independent restaurants are leading that new sustainable direction. And it's the chains that are dragging, and the National Restaurant Association that are just dragging change from happening, that are resisting so hard. And in the course of world history, everybody should try to think about, like, in the end, who emerges as victors? Is it people that resist change with all their might? Or is it people who innovate and pioneer and know that this is the direction of the industry? Let's figure out how to make it work. So who in the end is going to come out on the right side of history? Is it the National Restaurant Association and people who resist change? Or is it the amazing restaurant owners and the workers who are leading this change and saying, let's get to a place where everything is more sustainable for all of us, so that, frankly, all of us as consumers can enjoy a really great dining experience, much better than we had even before the pandemic.
Mm. And also long baths and meditation, right? It's like the self-care.
Exercise. A lot of exercise.
Yes. I feel you. What are you most excited about right now?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, there is this silver lining. I see change on the horizon. I see restaurants raising wages. And as much as the Restaurant Association still resists that, listen, I don't think there's any possibility that restaurants will raise wages this year to 15 and up, and then think that they're going to go back down to 2, 3, 4, 5 next year. It's just not happening. The workers aren't going to go back and accept going back to 5 and 6 and 2 and 3. They're just not going to take it. So I think as we go into next year and we see more and more workers leave the industry, and we see more and more restaurants raise wages to recruit staff, and the Restaurant Association finally understands this isn't going anywhere, we're all going to have to raise the wage. I do have a lot of hope that things are going to change. So I'm excited about policy change on the horizon. This is moving in Washington, D.C. on the ballot. Voters are going to get to vote for it in June. And, we already know it's going to pass. It's passed in the past, so we know it's going to pass. The governor of New York has indicated that this is one of her highest priorities, and she said she supports it. So I think there's a lot of potential for it to move in New York. It's moving in the legislature in Illinois and on the ballot in Michigan. And so it is moving. We're looking at actually many more states moving on this issue through legislation and ballot measures over the next several years. And I'm really excited about the potential for change that has resulted from workers finally standing up for themselves. Even Hooters, I'm going to say, because we've all known Hooters is problematic. We finally this year saw women at Hooters push back on the uniforms. That just hasn't happened in a really huge way before. So we're just seeing workers stand up for themselves. It's so exciting, and it is going to result in policy change. We know it.
And it really feels like it is shifting. And it seems like with more waves of COVID, it's not going away, right? Like it's not like the NRA can just out longevity this. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Who are you watching and inspired by in this work that sort of keeps you going?
I am watching workers across so many sectors. I'm watching the Kellogg workers on strike. I am watching workers at Starbucks form a union. I am watching all kinds of workers standing up for themselves, childcare workers and teachers and nurses. I mean, we're seeing so many workers stand up for themselves in ways, a much wider swath of society than we've seen before. We are seeing workers across many different sectors and feeling really inspired by that.
And What sort of books, this is a question for you, what is the book you most often give as a gift?
What is the book I most often give as a gift?
Could be your own books.
Well, the people I buy books most for is often my kids. So it's not been one book, it's been lots of different books. I guess I do mostly gift my books. I mean, that's just natural given that I have them. Yeah, I've written a couple books about the restaurant industry. My most recent book, One Fair Wage, Ending Sub Minimum Pay in America, is actually details all the different sub minimum wages in the US, many of which are direct legacies of slavery. So it tells the stories of tipped workers, not just restaurant workers, but also nail salon and car wash and parking attendant and wheelchair in the airport. The people who move your wheelchairs, those people get that ridiculous $2 wage and have to live off of tips. So lots of different tipped workers who get a sub minimum wage. But I also tell the story of incarcerated workers who get a sub minimum wage because of the exception to the 13th Amendment that allows for slavery in the case of incarceration. People can be paid as little as pennies. Here in California, where I live, a third of our firefighting workforce with, these huge wildfires we've had are incarcerated people who get like $1 a day. It's a shame. It's an outrage for this country. If people are doing work, they should be paid. So we tell the stories of incarcerated workers. We tell the stories of workers with disabilities who also get ridiculous pennies on the dollar for working at places like Goodwill and Salvation Army. And then also gig workers who don't get a wage at all, who are paid as independent contractors, but truly are employees, or what we call misclassified as employees. And they should be getting at least the equivalent of a full minimum wage, but they're not. They pay for their own costs, their own cars, their own gas, their own mechanisms for transportation and to do the work. And so they end up with a sub minimum wage. So all these different sectors are being paid a sub minimum wage. And it's very much a shame to the United States of America. So my latest book, One Fair Wage, Ending Sub Minimum Pay of America, is a book of stories of workers from these different sectors and really calls for us to remember what is the meaning of a minimum wage. I mean, the word minimum means that it's not supposed to be anything less than that, but you've got at least a tenth of the American workforce earning far less than the minimum wage legally. That's what needs to end. That is a direct result of influence of corporations over our democracy. And so that's why I'm saying this is, yes, a question of economics and justice, but it is fundamentally a question of our democracy.
And it does stand out that what you're fighting for, again, is like minimum as opposed to living wage. So many people are already thinking about what is the living wage, and what you're advocating for is, of course, we'd love a living wage, but let's just get to minimum wage first.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, we need both. We need one wage, not two tiers of wages, one wage, a fair wage. That's what we say, one fair wage. So I think, we're trying to raise the wage everywhere to 15 at least and end the sub minimum wage for tipped workers. And honestly, even 15 is not enough anymore. We're very proud to be part of an effort in California to raise the wage to $18 an hour, because not just in San Francisco and LA, but also in Fresno and Bakersfield, 15 is not enough. 15 is not enough anywhere at this point. So we really need to be honest about what's happened. It's not radical to raise the wage to 15 or 18. It's truly radical to suppress the wage so much that the overall minimum wage hasn't gone up in a decade and the sub minimum wage for tipped workers hasn't gone up in 30 years. That is radical. That is radical. That is what people in other countries would call, a radical right that has had such undue influence over even Democrats in our legislature, with such extreme politics as to say we shouldn't have to pay people more than $2 an hour. That is extreme radicalism. It's not radical to say people should get paid at least a survivable wage, a livable wage. I won't even say a living wage, which implies something else, but a survivable, livable wage, which is 15 or 18 in this moment.
And one question we like to ask towards the end is, what do you need right now, and how can the listeners help you grow this next economy?
We need everybody out there to really do three things. One is everybody eats out. So you can go to our website, onefairwage.org, And when you click on that take action or get involved button, you'll see a button that takes you to the list of restaurants that are now paying one fair wage. We want you to go support those restaurants in your state that are now paying one fair wage. But when you go, tell them, I'm coming here to support you because you're paying a fair wage, a full wage to your tipped workers. I want you to keep doing that. I expect you to keep doing that. And I want you to consider getting involved in this High Road Association raise, and you can show them the website. That's one. Two is we need you to contact your legislator, your state legislators, your federal legislators. There are links to that also on the website, onefairwage.org. Tell your legislator that you as a consumer, or if you're a worker or an employer, that you, especially as a consumer, you do not think you should be subsidizing restaurants to pay their own workers' wages. You think they should pay their own workers' wages like every other business in the United States, and that your tips should be on top of that, not instead of a wage. That's two. And then three, we really need you to let everybody you know about this. You can do that by getting my book and sharing it with people this holiday season, One Fair Wage, Ending Summon and Pay in America. Or you can do that by going to our website and sharing it with people. But, you know, we've done this work for a while, but still we find so many people who don't even know that there's a sub-minimum wage of $2 an hour and that tipped workers are still being paid this ridiculous, literally slave wage, literal legacy of slavery wage. We need people to know, we need people to get outraged, and we need them to support the restaurants that are doing it differently and let electeds know that enough is enough. I think the more electeds understand, and they don't right now, that pretty much everybody in the US agrees with this. If you poll on this issue, it polls popularly among all groups. Pretty much everybody agrees. It's just that they're in an echo chamber with lobbyists who don't represent most Americans, and they should be listening to their constituents, not the trade lobbyists.
And so any other websites or places can go to learn about your work, like social media, et cetera?
You can check out my Twitter at Saru Jayaraman, SaruJayaraman, or One Fair Wage's social media, Facebook and Twitter accounts. But a lot can be found on our website, onefairwage.org.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Saru. This is incredibly insightful. And I think, really inspiring that potentially there's some silver linings to come out of this. And I was inspired to hear you say that you're feeling more positive about it because you're sort of deep in this work. And so I wanted to make sure it wasn't just a news narrative, that employees or workers may actually have some subtle shifts in power. So it's good to hear that you're seeing that reflected on the ground.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining.
For sure. Thanks for having me.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.